Yeah, microphone. But this microphone is functioning, huh? Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you at the guest lecture of Professor Joseph Weiler, who is now a university professor at New York University Law School and senior fellow at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. But he served previously in Europe as president of the European University Institute in Florence, and he's co-editor-in-chief of the European Journal of International Law and the International Journal of Constitutional Law. And he's also a novel writer. He has written a novel, a short story, in English, but published in Germany. It's very interesting. Professor Weiler is maybe some people or many people are known not for a special feature of their activity, and Professor Weiler maybe is best known anyway in Europe and in Poland as a theoretician of law and religion, maybe, and he's known because of his view that, for instance, the European Constitution should have mentioned its Christian roots. So he has written a book which is also translated in Polish. Chrześcijańska Europa is the yes, you have it. One of the here, one of the present. Probably you know it, of course. It's in Poland, in Polish. Chrześcijańska Europa. And Professor Weiler was twice maybe at the Law Faculty of Warsaw. Once he held a Petraszycki lecture under the title Freedom of Religion and Freedom from Religion. It's a very important distinction which people normally forget. It was in May 2011, so 10 years before. Now, and then he was at the conference organized by our faculty, also together with the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg, in September 2017. And the title was Protecting European Values, about the breaches of Article 2 TUE and their consequences. This book was published in the meantime. The proceedings were published in the meantime in Germany in open access. So it is, and the speech of Professor Weiler is preceding all other speeches, is the first one in this volume. So maybe it's enough. I'm not going to exhaust you too much. So I will give the floor to Mrs. Bach-Golecka.
Yes, so I would like to say a few words once again of presentation of Professor Weiler, and also of expressing the gratitude of him coming here, of accepting the invitation of our Faculty of Law and Administration, and in particular the Center for Canon Law. And we are grateful especially for coming him in person, like in pre-pandemic times, and hopefully a sign for post-pandemic. We have a transmission, the online transmission, but that's a sign for probably coming to the days of before the pre-COVID times. And I would like also to say a few words, maybe informally, of his life and to express also the gratitude and admiration for his peace and kindness and tolerance, which is so rare in the contemporary world, full of political tensions and also Polish-Israeli tensions of the presence. So maybe this lecture would be a sign of expressing tolerance based upon spirituality, examining laws, kosher laws that have some hidden dimension that may be used as a source of inspiration for respect, for mutual dialogue, Jewish, Christian, like in canon law. And also I would like to say a few words about Father Maciej Ziemba, who passed away at the last day of the last year, the 31st of December 2020, who was a friend of Professor Weiler, who was the interpreter of John Paul II. He was the provincial superior of Blackfriars, the Dominicans. He also worked for the Bishop Council for Europe and the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. And why I am speaking about Father Ziemba, because once he died, it was the initiative of Professor Weiler to give 5 lectures in memory of Father Ziemba. The lectures were online, and the lectures were dealing with the topics of law in the Old Testament, but also the professor is aware of the New Testament. He was speaking about the present situation in Europe, and this is a real sign of friendship that is cross-border, cross-religious, and this is a vivid example of such an amicable attitude of Professor Weiler. But I would also like to say a few words about the past of Professor Weiler, the past of his student times. He confessed that once being a student, he had to learn his living. So during the day he was studying, and at night he was a laborer, he was a worker, he was in the trade unions, railway trade unions in the United Kingdom. So those times that were full of hardship and hard work may also serve as an example for us, for the present students, that the hardship times may lead to success, to respect and the highest degrees at the university. And as far as the numerous titles of Professor Weiler, I would like to stress his education at the European University Institute in Florence, also honorary professorship at the University of Copenhagen, which is our partner university within the 4EU Plus Alliance of the University of Warsaw. Professor Weiler, maybe due to the book, The Christian Europe, had been awarded the Italian citizenship by the President of Italy, the first decision of the Italian presidency. And he is also a panel member of World Trade Organization, NAFTA, the International Chamber of Commerce. And last but not least, within the European Championship, he is a member of the Governance Committee of FIFA, Federal Association of Football. So, and he is a football admirer. So, yes, this is the important time. The title of today's lecture is dealing with kosher laws. So I would like to say that maybe I'm just predicting because I don't know what the professor is going to say, that we are coming back after 1,972 years to the decisions of the First Jerusalem Council and the possible split, the decision that were made that affected the Jews and Christians. So we have a common history, and Professor, the floor is yours, the screen is yours, and because the professor starts the public lectures with a prayer, so please commence the prayer and the lecture.
יהיו לרצון אמרי פי והגיון ליבי לפניך, השם צורי וגואלי. Dziękuję panie dziekanie, dziękuję panie profesor. Muszę przyznać, że jestem trochę zdenerwowany. Wykład z teologii na Uniwersytecie Warszawskim dla mnie trochę skomplikowany. Dlaczego? Język. Jestem pewny, że wszyscy pamiętacie wieżę Babel. I tak zaczyna się ta historia. Moment, czytam. A była wszystka ziemia jednego języka i jednej mowy. Więc jaki to był język? Oczywiście polski. I teraz wiemy, dlaczego zbudowano wieżę, bo też Bóg mówił po polsku i mówi po polsku. Więc po prostu chcieli sobie z nim mieć miłą pogawędkę. Piękne słowa, pogawędka. I tutaj mamy dowód na to, że nawet Bóg Starego Testamentu był Bogiem miłosierdzia, przynajmniej od czasu do czasu. Polski to taki trudny język, powiedział do siebie Bóg. I więc, jeszcze raz czytam, werset 8. A tak rozproszył je Pan stamtąd po obliczu wszystkiej ziemi i dał każdemu inny język, ale o wiele łatwiejszy. Teraz mówię tylko o językach, które znam. Angielski. Angielski najłatwiejszy język. Dlaczego? Bo nie ma gramatyki. Po angielsku wiem, kim jestem. Joseph Weiler. Zamiast po polsku codziennie muszę decydować. Dzisiaj będę Joseph Weiler, Josephem Weilerem, Josepha Weilera, Josephie Weiler. Angielski, dzięki Bogu. Francuski, włoski, hiszpański. Oni mają gramatykę, ale nic jej nie używa. Naprawdę. Niemiecki. To szczególny przypadek. Trochę trudny, ale nie jak polski, proszę. I brzydki. A hebrajski też szczególny przypadek, trochę trudny i piękny. I w końcu jidysz. Jidysz nie może się decydować, czy jest to niemiecki, polski czy hebrajski. Rezultat? Fatalna kombinacja. Złego niemieckiego, złego polskiego, złego hebrajskiego. Ale bardzo ekspresyjnie, to po polsku? Bardzo ekspresyjnie. Chcecie wiedzieć różnicę między niemieckim a jidysz? Myślimy o Hamlecie. Po niemiecku sein oder nicht sein, Das ist hier die Frage. Być albo nie być, to pytanie. Po Jiddisch, sein oder nicht sein, das ist die Frage. Sein. Być albo nie być, to pytanie. Być. Bardzo, bardzo chciałbym dzisiaj dać mój wykład po polsku. 15 miesięcy temu decydowałem uczyć się polskiego. Koszmarny. Ale wykład z teologii, mój polski jest zbyt prymitywny. Nie mogę. Ale mam nadzieję. Nadzieja to ważne, nie? Mam nadzieję, może w następnym roku będę mógł nie tylko wygłosić wykład po polsku, ale też porozmawiać z Bogiem. So now I'm afraid English. So why do Jews observe kosher? So the first thing to say is that not all Jews observe kosher. If there may be 12 million Jews in the world, people who identify themselves as Jews, maybe 20 or 30% observe kosher. And now you're going to ask me, okay, tell us, what does observing kosher mean? If I had to do that, it wouldn't be a lecture from 12 to 2. It would be a lecture from 12 days to 24 days. So I'll just give you some examples. Observing kosher is both irritating and seems senseless. Why irritating? So here are a few examples from my observance of kosher. Professor Weilera, we are so honored that you come to dinner at our house. We know that you observe kosher, so we are not going to serve pork, but we have the best beef in Paris. Is there a problem? Nie koshernie. Example number 2. Professor Weilera, we are so honored that you are coming to our house for dinner. We know you observe kosher. Only fish. The best sturgeon or swordfish, and even beluga caviar. Is there a problem? Nie koshernie. But it's fish. Why? You ask me why? You speak Polish, ask him. Did I write the Bible? I'll give you one more example. Professor Weilera, we are so honored that you invited us to your home for dinner. And we heard that you make the best brisket on the East Coast. That's true. We brought the dessert, ice cream. Is there a problem? Well, you know, we're having meat during the meal. We cannot have milk. So before we go to the meal, we go to my library, and Candida brings in a parfait. That's milk. So he says, excuse me, Professor Weilera, but didn't you say that you cannot have in the same meal milk and meat? Yes, but you can have milk before the meat, but not milk after the meat. What is that? You speak Polish? Ask him. So it's irritating, and it seems senseless. Now, I have to say something that is very important. It's a prejudice that has been around for 2,000 years. And even the great and mighty fall prey to this prejudice. Max Weber, Emil Durkheim. And what is the prejudice? The prejudice is that the Jewish religion is all about legalisms. They circumcise their penises, we circumcise our heart. People who say that have just not opened the Bible. The moral law is as central to Jewish practice as is the ritual law. And not only is it central, as you read in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Habakkuk and Hosea, if you don't observe the moral law, your ritual observance is worthless. You make the temple a den of thieves. So both not only have equal weight, but one is dependent on the other. No moral law, the ritual practice. If you have that prejudice, please get rid of it. But today the lecture is focusing on the ritual law, because that does distinguish Judaism. It's not only the moral law. We keep all these irritating rules like kosher. So the way I framed the lecture was, why do Jews observe kosher? Now, there can be many explanations to the question, why? Why do you go to Mass? Because I observe kosher because my parents observe kosher. Because if I don't observe kosher, my friends will not come to eat in my house. Because I'm just used to observing kosher. I'm not interested in that type of answer, sociological, psychological, etc. I'm only interested in the religious and spiritual dimension of observing kosher. And to answer the question, why do those Jews who observe kosher, from a religious point of view, there's only one simple answer, because the covenant demands that you observe kosher. So we could end the lecture here and go and have lunch, maybe a kosher lunch. No, because what I want to do is not to ask why, but what are the religious and spiritual consequences of observing kosher? Now, it's important not to confuse the consequence and the effect with reason. I'll give you an example. I walk to synagogue on the Sabbath. It's the only exercise I do. So it has a health benefit. So the effect of walking to the synagogue on Sabbath, one effect is it is healthy. But if I said the reason I walk to the synagogue on the Sabbath is because it's healthy, I would be denying the religious significance of not using an automobile. So I remind you of that, because what I'm going to describe now are the effects of kosher observance, which should not be confused with the reason to do it. The reason to do it is because the covenant so demands. So I'm going to speak about 4 types of effect. And after the stand-up comic of the first few minutes, now we get to the serious stuff. So the first effect comes from the nature of Abrahamic monotheism. We think of Abrahamic, and now keep in mind the Old Testament, because here Christianity really is, in a remarkable way, somewhat different. Abrahamic monotheism is not simply the belief in a single God. It is also that, but also the Egyptians believed in a single God for some time, the sun. So Abrahamic monotheism has 3 dimensions. We like trinities, don't we? So one is a single God. The second is the transcendental nature of God. God is not the sun, he's not a river, he's not a golden calf. He has no presence in time because he was always there, he is always there, and he will be always there. He has no presence in space. Although we look up to heaven, we could just as well look down and God is there. It's a transcendental God, which in some ways is not even describable with our human imagination, because we are constrained by that. Now, it's also the God of love. You cannot love a transcendental God because it's like loving the idea of God and not a living God. So, in the Abrahamic monotheistic tradition, God breaches his transcendence in moments of immanence. And we call that revelation. We call that the intervention of God in history. So he took them out of Egypt, the Israelites. He gave them the Torah at Mount Sinai. So these are moments of immanence of the transcendental God. But what characterizes these moments of imminence is they took place thousands of years ago. And they only live in our mind as a memory. But if it's to be a living religion, how do we keep the presence of God in our consciousness, in our daily lives, when it's a transcendental God, whose breaches of imminence were a memory? So now let's get back to kosher observance, and I want to say something about food, eating. So the first thing about food, we need food and eating in order to live. When Descartes says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, I say, yes, Mr. Descartes, that may be so, but before you start cogitating, you must eat. Otherwise, you wouldn't be around to cogitate. So we need food for our existence. But if we look at our culture, food is much more than survival. There are more cookbooks, unfortunately, that are sold than the books of Olga Tokarczuk. I'm very sad to make that observation. And think how much food. Where will we eat? What restaurant do we go to? What's on the menu? I just came back from my holiday in Spain. What wonderful food. No, the food in Greece is more important. Who is inviting me to dinner? Who is not inviting me to dinner? Food is not just existence, it's a central part of our daily existence. And now think of these stupid, in quotes, kosher rules. From the minute you wake up in the morning, from that first wonderful cup of coffee, throughout the day, breakfast, a little break at 10 o'clock, obiad, afternoon tea, kolatsy. Every piece of food you put in your mouth, you have to think, what does God demand of me? Can I eat it? Can I not eat it? It's a constant presence of the transcendental God with a transcendental truth which is present in our life. Now, nota bene. The mistake that very often is made is to say eating kosher is healthy, to give it a functional utilitarian meaning. It's nonsense. If you eat red meat full of cholesterol, even if it's kosher, it's not healthy. You can have a healthy kosher diet and you can have an unhealthy kosher diet. I prefer the unhealthy one, but it's got nothing to do with health. It has no moral and ethical significance. You are not bound by the covenant. You eat pork. Do I think you're doing something unethical? No. No more unethical than eating kosher food. So it has no ethical. In fact, we can't give a functional explanation to the kosher rules. And that takes me back to my first point, the way kosher helps breach the transcendence challenge of Abrahamic monotheism. Every time I put something in my mouth, every invitation I get, and I ask kosher, not kosher, it's not because I'm asking healthy, not healthy, ethical, not ethical. There's one reason alone. That's what the Blessed One, holy be He, has commanded me to eat and not to eat. So that is the first effect, the first significance. The second effect, the second significance. Here we have to go back to the story of Adam and Eve. What we don't note when we read that story, and it's in the text, expressis verbis, that the animals could eat everything, all the fruit of all the trees. Only Adam and Eve were told not to eat from this particular tree. And like kosher rules, they were never given an explanation. They were not told it's unhealthy. They were told you're not allowed to eat it. It seemed arbitrary. Now, I have to make a digression, because I want to talk about some other ritual rules which are like kosher. If you were to ask me, you know, in the Bible there are 613 commandments. Maimonides has written a book called the Book of Commandments, which he comments on each one of them. It's a book worth reading. It's really very interesting. Maimonides is, if you want, the equivalent of Aquinas. They both Aristotelian. What are the most important among the 613 from a religious, spiritual point of view? Now, I'm giving you my opinion. This is not the Judaism opinion, because I think, like polls, when there are 3 Jews, there are 4 opinions and 5 political parties. So this is my view. So number 1 is the Sabbath, and I will come to it in a minute. Number 2 is kosher. And number 3, it's not the moral rules of sexuality, no adultery, etc. It's the ritual rules of sexuality. And if you ask me what are the ritual rules of sexuality, the most important one, even within a consecrated marriage, there are between 7 and 12 days a month where you cannot have sexual relations. You want to, please, you're not allowed. Now I go back to Adam and Eve and to the second significance of kosher observance. So you say 613 commandments, and when the rabbis finish interpreting them, they grow, you know, like judges. There's one law, and then there will be 15 judicial decisions. And people say, how can you live that life with the yoke, the weight? It's like a prisoner of all these legalisms. And what I want to suggest to you, it's the opposite. It's what Isaiah Berlin calls rational liberty. How can you regard this yoke as liberty? So the animals can eat everything they want. In some ways, they are slaves to their nature, to their desire. They're hungry, they eat whatever they want to eat. Humans, and that's symbolized in the story of Adam and Eve, but then the kosher rules, of course, amplify it. It's saying you cannot be a slave to your desires. You cannot eat everything that comes to your mind. And now to put it at its strongest, by enslaving myself to a transcendental truth, I'm something outside of this world. I become liberated within this world. I'm not a slave to my desires. You can see immediately how this is relevant to the ritual dimension of sexual rules. You might be in a loving relationship. We know how wonderful sex is. Both partners, they would love to. You cannot do it. You have to control it, because otherwise you would be a slave to that dimension of human nature. You enslave yourself to something outside this world, you become liberated within this world. And for people like us, those who might be watching online, which I imagine are mostly academics, etc., the Sabbath is the most important for our circumstance. Why? Because what is the biggest enslavement that you, Dean, that you, Professor, experience? It's slave to our careers. Writing that extra article, writing that extra book. I'm being invited to Harvard. I have to give a lecture on Monday, so I'm working all Sunday and I'm working all Saturday because that's so important. How can I go there unprepared, etc.? We are slave to our ambition, to our professional ambition, to our status, etc. Comes the Sabbath and says, no. Even in that respect, you have to be liberated from that type of enslavement to ambition, to career, to work. I'm not talking about the person who has to work in order to put bread on the table of his or her family. I'm talking about people like us who do not have to do it, and yet if we look at the lives we live, pratza, pratza, pratza. The Sabbath liberates from that. So that's the second consequence of observing kosher, and I gave these two other examples of the ritual law. You get that from the ritual law. You don't get that from the moral law. The moral law has other significance. Number 3, identity. Identity has a bad name, but identity is a deep value. Why is identity a deep value? There's a secular version, but I will give you the religious version. It's just easier, but there is a secular version. So we are all created in the image of God. Man and woman created he them. We read that in Genesis. The notion of human dignity comes from that, from being created in the image of God. And there are two sides to this coin. Side number 1, it's radical equality. Nobody's life is worth more than somebody else's life, because all of us were created in the image of God. So if somebody, if some regime, if some person says his life is more worthy than her life, it's a huge assault on their dignity because of the radical equality that everybody is created in the image of God. Now let's flip the coin and go to the other side of the coin. We are each unique. You, Mr. Dean, in all the history of human existence, there has never been somebody who had exactly your identity, your specificity, your uniqueness, and there will never be somebody like that. Our uniqueness is also an aspect of our dignity. We are not birds in a flock where one bird is equal to another bird. And if somebody says to you, you are fungible with somebody else, you would say, I'm not fungible with somebody else. I am unique. There's something, it doesn't lead to arrogance, but there's something that is uniquely my identity. And that is true also for collective identities. We might all believe, as we should do, in democracy, human rights, the rule of law. But that's our common heritage of mankind. But there's something of value. But we are Polish. We have our language, we have our history, we have our literature, we have our poets, we have our food, etc. And we are Italian. And it's worth preserving that because we are all equal in our worth. But the world is a richer place for having Poles and Italians, etc. So now, think of my son or my daughter, one of them, I have 5, who come to me and say, why are we not allowed to kill? Why should we be honest, etc.? And my answer is because we are human beings. If somebody comes and says, I say, it's also in the Bible. It's also we are commanded. But if somebody comes and says, I'm neither a Catholic, I'm neither a Jew or a Muslim, etc., so I don't believe in God, so I'm allowed to kill, we would say nonsense. By virtue of being a human being, you are not allowed to kill. There are certain values, sometimes we call them natural law, which we say are binding all of us and uniting all of us in our quality as human beings. Now the same daughter or son come to me and say, I've seen this commercial on television, a cheeseburger. It looks so tasty. In America, they think that McDonald's is tasty. We have to forgive them. It looks so tasty. Why can I not eat it? And my answer to him is, because we are Jewish. That's what we do, and that's what we don't do. Kosher rules and other rules help preserve the value of a world rich in different collective identities. There's something valuable to the world that there are Poles. There's something valuable to the world that there are Italians. And I think there's something valuable to the world that there are Jews. And it's exactly the ritual, the kosher type rules, which emphasize the unique identity rather than the common heritage of mankind. So that's the third effect or the third consequence. And the fourth is special to our era. We live basically in a secular world, at least in the West. You know that in the Bible, the word religion does not appear even once, because everybody was religious. The only question was which God you believed in. Religion as a concept only comes in when secularism comes in. But today we live in a secular world. And religious people are a minority. But for good or for bad, they think that being religious doesn't only pertain to them, but it's an important testimony to the world of a belief in some transcendental, not utilitarian truths. If I wear a yarmulke, or a Jewish woman covers her hair, or a Catholic woman wears a little crucifix, she is declaring her identity. I am Jewish, I am Catholic. When you observe kosher, and you remember the funny examples I gave you at the beginning, you are not confronting people with identity. You are confronting them with religious commitment. It's not just who I am, but what does it mean to be who I am in a very direct way. This is religious commitment. But it seems so silly. Yes, maybe it does. So why do you do it? Because I happen to be among those who believe in some forms of transcendental truth. And that confrontation, that demonstration, not simply of identity, but of actual religious commitment, is another consequence of kosher observance. So now I finish, and I hope I have given you some food for thought. Kosher food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Weiler. I would like to start with an anecdote which came to me as you showed. There is somebody above us, and because it is and has something to do with the not very crowded audience. And there was a professor of a mathematician, a professor of a Lemberg, Warsaw School of Mathematics. And well, I don't know whether he was a Jew or not, because I didn't recall even the name. But the anecdote is very funny itself, and it can be traced who told it. There was a professor in mathematics who made very, very difficult lectures in Lemberg. And just at the start, there were few people in room. And one of them was very, he was afraid that the lecture, at one day the lecture will fall apart. And he asked the professor, he asked him, Professor, you are used to lecture if there is, how is the minimum number of people in Rome? And the professor said three people. We must have 3 people because there is this tres faciunt collegium. The 3 people made the collegium, okay. And of course, professor was very difficult. The lecture was very difficult, and the people were less and less. And at one day, there were only 2 of them in Rome. And these students asked, so we have a lecture today? Yes. Well, the professor said, yes, because you are 2 and me, this is 3 together. And then the next lecture, there were only 1 student in the room. And this student said, Professor, I'm afraid we cannot have the lecture because there are 3 which are needed. And the professor said, we are 3. There is you, there is me, and there is somebody. So it's about the presence. It's an anecdote, but it has something deep also. And the second thing I would like to ask you, you mentioned this, maybe I didn't understand it very properly, but you told about something like overlapping of rational and religious, possible overlapping, and religious precepts and things like that. So there is this famous saying of Grotius, Hugo de Groot, who says, these rules at the beginning of the law of war and peace, and he says, these rules are so evident that there is God. But if there were no God, there would be also valid. And normally people interpret it in this way. Grotius, he was afraid that he was afraid that he will be accused of not of blasphemy, but of heresy, yeah, or something. Heresy. But maybe there is something more deep in that. I don't know. It's only an idea. Może ktoś z Państwa? You? Yeah?
Professor, can you make a presumption or tell us what do you think about the future and the kosher rules? I mean, what do you think if there will be more Jews who observe kosher or less? Because our culture today does not support rules, it supports rights. So every obligation is to be stated invalid. So what do you think about future?
So first of all, we should all support rights, especially fundamental human rights. But here is just before I answer your question directly, if I look at the Pentateuch, I can find only one single right in the Pentateuch. It's not a vocabulary of rights, it's not an ethos of rights. But if you look at my favorite chapter, Leviticus number 19, if you set aside the ritual rules and you look at the ethical rules in chapter 19, it's like the program of every good social democratic regime in today's world. Social responsibility, taking care of the poor, of the sick, etc. But it's all couched in the language of duties. You don't have a right to be loved by your neighbor, you have a duty to love thy neighbor. You don't have a right to a dignified material existence, you have a duty to make sure that everybody has it. And you have the duty, not somebody else, not the government, etc. It's very difficult for our culture to even begin to think with the vocabulary of duties instead of a vocabulary of rights. And this does not mean that I don't think that rights are important. What do I think about the future? I am almost 70 years old. And if one thing I've learned is not to predict the future. But we've been around for 3,000–4,000 years. I'm hoping that we will be around for another 3,000 or 4,000 years. Maybe more, maybe less. They always try to eliminate us, but somehow we survive. So I'm hoping that there will be kosher eaters. My children, my grandchildren, their grandchildren. Mamnajeh. But to predict, I cannot predict.
Okay, thank you for the lecture. And what struck me during it is that it seems that there are like many similarities in how you...
do you mind just for the question? Thank you very much.
What struck me was how many similarities are between how you interpret or understand kosher laws and how Christians think about land and asceticism in general. Like the explanation, if it can be, or the effects of observing some rules seem to be like really similar, as well as the percentage of people who actually observe those commandments. And the only thing maybe, or maybe this is as well some kind of false dichotomy, is that in Jewish religion, they seem to be like more formalized, and the Christians have, one would probably say, more liberal approach, although those are like the same like rules, laws, obligations. I think that at least nowadays, most of people don't think in those terms. They have like more modern perspective. Those are some like good deeds they do, but they usually may not think that they are like, they should do it. They are like forced by law to do them. And like, what is your perspective on this similarities and differences according to laws and obligations between Jewish and Christians?
I am always very careful when I have to comment on Christianity. But maybe next year you can invite me to speak about the trial of Jesus.
Absolutely, yeah.
But then you will have to fasten your seatbelts. So I have an indirect answer to your question. Our culture is that if there's a law, we want to understand what is its function. So with moral law, we understand the function. We understand why it is wrong to kill people. We understand why it is wrong to steal. We understand why it is wrong to lie, etc. And in our general culture, if you think about our rules of interpretation, in hermeneutics, in legal hermeneutics, the most important rule of interpretation is teleological. What is the purpose of the rule? And therefore we interpret it to be consistent with the purpose of the law. If we have an interpretation which runs against the purpose of the law, we say that must be a wrong interpretation because that's not what the law intended. As lawyers, that is very deeply rooted in us. And that's why people find so perplexing these ritual laws to which we cannot give a teleological interpretation. And what I tried, at least to make you think, if not to convince you, that it is precisely because we cannot give a teleological explanation. It's not because they are healthy. If we said it's healthy and then the scientists came and told us, well, actually, it's not healthy. Or actually, you thought that eating pig is not healthy and actually there's no danger in eating pig, then we would abolish the law. It would be a natural thing. And what I try to explain and make people think, even if I don't persuade them, that it is precisely the non-teleological nature of these rules that gives them their spiritual and religious significance. Not instead of moral rules, but in addition to moral rules, because there's more to religion than morality. I think there can be a 100% atheist who is a totally honorable, ethical, moral person. Religious people do not have a monopoly over ethics and morality. What religion introduces, which secular worldview simply does not even have the words, it's the idea of holiness, of sacredness. That is a religious category. And the religious ritualistic rules, they emphasize the dimension of holiness and sacredness. Also moral rules. But the ritualistic rules, they really push it on you. So if a Christian thinks, maybe now I have another explanation for not eating meat in the 40 days of Lent, why do we not do it, the child asks? Because we are Catholic. Because in this way we feel, etc., etc. I'm happy if it adds a dimension to other religion understanding of what sacredness, holiness means. But that's not my purpose. My purpose is just to explain this funny practice of Jews which observe what seem to be these funny rules. You can have milk before meat, you cannot have milk after meat, etc. It has no intrinsic value. In your stomach, the meat and the milk mix together. But it means that when you sit down to a meal, you have to decide, will it be milchig, that's Yiddish, or will it be fleisig? And it cannot be both. It cannot be the same. And that I try to explain with these 4 consequences that I gave you. So I really hesitate to comment in any way on Christian practice.
So, Professor, may I have a question concerning, the kosher laws, the 613 commandments of Maimonides in Maimonides' commentary. But is there a minimum that one has to respect in order to observe kosher? Is there a maximum? Is it possible to observe 613 commandments? And where is the authority to decide? Is it up to an individual to decide, I'm going to observe, let's say, 10 or 20 commandments, and then I'm observing kosher? Or is there a rabbi or another person who is in charge to decide for the collective?
That's a very subversive question. So first of all, there's no religious hierarchy in Judaism. So this will be the decision of every rabbi, of every community, etc. And I often joke and I say, when do I know that there's an important Jewish community? When they have kosher wars. One rabbi says, that's not kosher. The other rabbi says, it is kosher. When you have kosher wars, I know we have a healthy Jewish community. Now, if I look at my own family, my brother is much more strict than I am. I would go into, not in Israel, but when I'm outside Israel, because in Israel there are many kosher restaurants, I will eat in a non-kosher restaurant, but I will have salad, I will have some kind of fish, etc. My brother would not enter such a restaurant because he says, but the fish was cooked in a dish which also cooked pork. That's not kosher. So, à la margine, at that kind of margin, there's lots of practices. But there is the central corpus of kosher observance that if you don't observe it, it's difficult to say that you observe kosher. The type of foods that you can eat. Either you're kosher or you're not kosher. The non-mixing of milk and meat. And there's a range of the core of kosher. It's an empirical observation. It's not a theological observation. When people don't observe, it's quite common. People say, I'm kosher at home, but I'm not kosher when I go out. That's not observing kosher. So there is a core that even a person to himself will say, well, it's more a cultural thing for me. It's less a religious kind of commitment. But I remember when I was the rector in Florence, we had a guest from Israel who observed kosher. So the kitchen said, you can eat because the president, we prepare kosher food for him, even kosher wine. And they prepared a meal, and then he said, but in what did you cook this? And they said, in the normal thing. And he said, but we wash them very carefully. And then he said, I'm sorry. And they were so surprised. It's kosher for the president and it's not kosher for you? So at the margin there is, but at the core, it's quite a common heritage. You observe kosher, you do not observe kosher. It's also a question of trust. I remember one of the chief rabbis of Israel, he said, I will never eat at anybody's home, even the other chief rabbi, because I cannot trust that it's really kosher. I call that fundamentalism. He calls it piety. So you find that. But at the core, there's a corpus that one can very easily tell this is kosher observance, this is not kosher observance.
And what is the authority of a rabbi within the community? Is it possible to have one's own rules concerning kosher that
yes,
may be different from
many
the
people
rabbi?
Many people have their own rules. But even they, towards themselves, they know at a certain point, this is not serious. This is not real kosher observance. And there's some social restriction, because if you have your own rules and you invite somebody to your home, they have to trust that you observe kosher. And if your own rules do not conform with the community standard of kosher, you would be violating an ethical rule, which you find in the Bible. You should not put an obstacle in front of a blind person. So the blind person here is your guest. He trusts that he's eating in a kosher home. And if you have your own rules which deviate from the community standard, you are putting an obstacle in front of a blind person. So that acts as a constraint more than what the rabbi said, etc. And it's a powerful constraint because you want people to be able to come to your home and trust that they're eating kosher food. But for example, you fly. So El Al, the Israeli national airline, only serves kosher food. But you sometimes see very, very Orthodox people, they don't trust El Al, and they insist of having their own kosher food. I call that fundamentalism, they call that piety. This is where we have to be forgiving. That great Christian virtue.
Maybe I have another question, may I?
Not too difficult, please.
No, only
No, I'm teasing.
about kosher, because there were questions here from the audience also, and in this sense, and do you can you be right? How to say? I don't say Orthodox, by a Jew, who conserves his Jewishness and so, and not observing kosher, or is kosher, how to say? It's a part of the core of the Jewishness. So if you say, well, I'm a Jew, but I'm kosher is Samet egal or something like that.
Samet egal, yes. I think I answered that question in the very first thing I said when I got beyond the stand-up comic to the serious part of the lecture, when I shifted from my bad Polish to my reasonable English. There are, depending how you count, there are between 12 and 14 million Jews who live in the world today. As I said, the majority do not observe kosher, but they think of themselves very strongly as Jews. Because, again, in the book of Exodus, we see that two things happen at the same time. It's a religion, and it's also a peoplehood. So, from a Jewish perspective, it's not an oxymoron to say, I am an atheist Jew. You cannot say, I am an atheist Christian. If you're an atheist, you're not a Christian. But you can say, I am an atheist Jew, because Jew is also peoplehood, tribehood, etc. So in that respect, it's a very clear answer to your question. Probably a majority of Jews think of themselves culturally, nationally, etc., as Jewish. It's very important to them, but they are not religious. They're not observant. They don't observe the Sabbath. They don't observe kosher rules, and I don't know what they do in bed. But I expect the same goes there. And yet, they feel very strongly as Jews. So, kosher observant is just a marker for your religiosity, not to your belongingness to the Jewish people. And believe me, the Nazis did not ask, do you observe kosher or do you not observe kosher, before they killed you. You belong to the Jewish people. This is what is going to happen to you. So it's a test of religiosity. It's not a test of belongingness to this ancient tribe.
And is it possible to observe all the kosher rules, or are there some that are impossible?
My dear Doba, you could ask this question, is it possible to observe all the rules, the 613 plus all the interpretations? My answer is, there's a Hasidic tradition that at any given time in the world, there are only 36 truly pious Jews. So those 36 may observe all the rules. Everybody else is condemned in some way or another to be a sinner. If you start looking at it.
And I have also another question concerning not only the kosher rules, but the Sabbath rules. Would you comment on the rules of the Sabbath? Because, for instance, it is forbidden to watch TV or to use the computer. And how is it? How this rule has evolved? What is the development of the rules concerning Sabbath, and who is interpreting the the prohibitions and rules concerning Sabbath.
So, in ancient times, you were not allowed to light a fire on the Sabbath. If there was a fire burning, it could go on burning, but you could not light a fire on the Sabbath. And in ancient times in the Bible, if you lit a fire on the Sabbath, if you even went and collected wood for Sabbath, capital punishment, oy vey. So when electricity comes in my view, through a mistake. But that doesn't matter, because once it's decided, it becomes tradition, etc. It was made equivalent to lighting a fire. So you cannot turn the light on, you cannot turn the television on. There's some justification to think about that, because originally lights, it got very hot and therefore it gave light, so they say that is like fire. So you either keep the lights on or you keep them off. So that's how these kind of rules develop. Society develops, new technologies come in, and one has to ask, how do we interpret the old rules in the relation to new technological developments? There's a journal, which all that legal journal does is to ask those questions. What do we do? For example, you have to say 3 prayers a day, in the morning, in the evening, and at night. So, of course, immediately somebody says, so what is going to happen to the astronaut that is going around the world in 2 hours? When is morning, when is evening, when is night? What is going to happen on the North Pole, where the sun never sets? The Sabbath begins when the sun sets, but it sets and then it starts again. When does the Sabbath begin? So that gives job to people who like to deal with trivia. No, I beg your pardon, not trivia. But it's a kind of organic, it's like we interpret the Constitution, especially constitutions which are very difficult to change, like the American Constitution. So regularly we ask ourselves, how do we interpret this rule in the light of modern development? So that is how that developed. The second thing is if it's connected to work. So the only reason you would turn your computer on is for work. So even from that reason, it might be prohibited. So you would say, no, I turn it on to send a very nice email to my friend Josepha. That's not work. So they say, yes, but it's electricity. We're not allowed to write on the Sabbath. I can send you 3 books from where this has come, that you're not allowed to write on the Sabbath. But I will tell you something else. I love those rules. No television, no cell phone, no WhatsApp, no email. It makes you feel the Sabbath. It's a day which is different from any other day. It really adds to the holiness of the day. So regardless of the legalistic interpretation why you're not allowed to do it, we even have a concept which we say, I know people will say, okay, you're not allowed to turn the television on, but I will keep I will never turn it off. So then I can watch the World Cup even on the Sabbath because I haven't turned my television on. And the answer is yes, but that's not in the spirit of the Sabbath. So even though strictly legalistically speaking, you're not violating the rule, you're violating the spirit of the Sabbath. So a lot of these rules are also developed in terms of the spirit of the Sabbath.
I was thinking about the 4th effect you gave, so the testimony of religion. And I'm wondering, because I think there's a thin border between testimony and manifestation of religion. And it's not only there's a thin border between testimony and manifestation of religion. And it's not only about Jews, but it's about every religion and every visual sign that we obey the rules. Probably not only religion, but every identity. So do you have any, like, where is the border? What's the borderline between observing kosher or observing any ritual laws of any religion to keep this identity of the nation, of the people of the religion, and not to do it as manifestation?
Mm-hmm. So, just to go back to this, what you call religious testimony, and what I emphasized was that it's not just enough to declare your identity, it's to confront the world with religious commitment. The difference between the third and the fourth, that the third is inward looking. It's maintaining the identity inward looking, what it means to be a Catholic for your Catholic children, for your Catholic community, etc. Whereas the fourth one, it's confronting the world. So you can say it's two sides of the same coin, but I still think there's a difference. And the fourth one is not Jewish specific. I think it's a commitment of, it should be a commitment of all religious people in a secular world, because if I look at decisions of the courts, the European Court of Justice, the European Court on Human Rights, etc., they are operating in good faith. They are decent, honest, etc. But our culture is such that they don't even understand religious commitment. It's difficult for them to understand what it means to be religious. Because if you haven't grown up, if it's not part of your general culture, and in that respect, I think all Abrahamic religions are the same. It's to remind the world of what it means to have religious commitment. Now, let me emphasize, of course the ethical comes first. So you can say I'm also reminding the world by practicing the high moral, ethical values of the religion. But I already said that I know religious people who are terrible, and I know atheists who are noble. The ethical dimension is very important testimony, but it doesn't have, because an atheist could say, well, I'm also honest, I am also follow an ethical, etc. So strangely, it is the ritualistic rules that in a more direct way confront the world with religious commitment to a transcendental truth, which is not teleological, which is not, if you just think deeply, you can come to the same conclusion yourself. And maybe 100 years ago or 200 years ago, I wouldn't have said that. But in today's world, I think that's important, to remind people to not let this culture die. To not let this culture die. So it's not about evangelization. I don't evangelize. Judaism is not a proselytizing religion. Everybody is welcome. But it's not a proselytizing religion. But I think the world in which we live, Western culture, Western civilization, the heritage of the French Revolution, we are all children of the French Revolution, the heritage of Athens, we should also remind the world of the heritage of Jerusalem and Rome. And that's why in this book, A Christian Europe, it was not an evangelization. But when I saw in the draft constitution, it started off with a reference to Thucydides, to Athens. So Athens, yes, and Jerusalem and Rome, no, that's European culture. So it's keeping, if European culture, European civilization has two roots, Athens and Rome, we should not let that go away. And one way to not let that go away, not just an idea, is to confront people with religious commitment. So they have to ask themselves, they have to say, what is this? What does it mean, etc. So I think the difference between number 3 and number 4 is one is inward looking, what you tell your children, and one is outward looking, what you tell the world. And I think both are important. I tell you a nice story about the Constitution of Europe. So, no, this is not for the internet. Excuse me.
So, do you think that there is the analogous development of the kosher laws and the Sabbath laws concerning possible differentiation between the observance as far as the food rules and the rest rules?
There is a famous Jewish scholar by the name of Chaim Soloveitchik, and he pointed out what he thought was an unhealthy development. That as these rules develop, both kosher and the Sabbath, they become more and more strict. And why do they become more and more strict? He said, because people want to show their piety. The rabbis want to show their piety. So now suddenly, is water kosher or not kosher? Lettuce, is that kosher or not kosher? We never asked those questions. Suddenly it has become an issue. And I regret that. I regret that because in my view it doesn't come from a particularly good place. This kind of excessive piety, etc. Adding more and more restrictions on the Sabbath, adding more and more restrictions to kosher rules. So if there is development, it mostly goes in that direction. And I don't believe that it's particularly helpful. I don't think it shows a sign of piety. But many people, they feel more pious if they pile on themselves more and more restrictions. It's a problem for my children, not me. They will have to live with that. And maybe rebel against it. And it also has another negative thing. The more ritual regulation you pile on, it's a temptation for people to think that that's the most important thing and to forget the ethical rules. So I do this and I don't do this and I do this and I don't do this, all connected with this universe of ritual rule. And suddenly the healthy balance between the ethical and the ritual becomes distorted. That's a very negative development, and it happens. But you are familiar with that. It's not just a Jewish phenomenon. You cheat in the shop and then you go to Mass. What's the meaning of that? You cheat in the shop and then you go to a kosher restaurant. What's the meaning of that? But this tendency of adding more and more restrictions pushes in that direction, to distort the balance between the ritual and the ethical. But if you ever read Leviticus chapter 19, you will see how striking it is. You have, love thy neighbor as thyself, I am the Lord. And you know what comes immediately after that? You don't know. You're not allowed to mix in your clothes linen and wool. More arbitrary than that, you cannot imagine. But one next to the other. And the economy of chapter 19, it's where holiness is explained. I am holy, therefore you should be holy too, is continuously through the chapter. An ethical rule, a ritual rule. An ethical rule, a ritual rule. And I say there should be a nice balance between the two. If you add to the ritual excessively, you might be distorting the balance between love thy neighbor as thyself, don't mix wool and linen.
And is it always the rabbi that decides? Are there any popular movements in Judaism that, for instance, tend to stress the spiritual dimension or certain charismatic and not the ritualistic one.
Oczywiście. 3 Jews, 4 opinions, 5 Hasidic sects, and a lot of personality worship. My rabbi is more important than your rabbi. My rabbi is greater than your rabbi. That's the human condition. So there's this big, that's why you have to read Olga Tokarczuk, the books of Jacob. You see that so vividly there. All these tension between the various Hasidics, etc. Human will be humans. Humans will be humans. So yes, you have a zillion popular movements, etc. But here's the funny thing. So theologically, they can be totally opposed to each other. They all observe kosher. It's strange, huh? Maybe we should end.
Yes, so we have ended with the mention of Olga Tokarczuk, the Nobel Prize winner. So, Professor, we would like to wish you your next book on the trial of Jesus, maybe also would be rewarded with such a prize. And please
No, I don't
do
think...
come at the university here in Warsaw to celebrate.
I have my doubts. No, I don't have my doubts. I am certain it will not be. But I do the best I can. It will be an interesting book, very challenging.
So thank you very much for the presence. Thank you very much for your real presence, pre-COVID and post-COVID, hopefully. And I would like to invite all of you within the internet transmission and here to the next lecture of Professor Weiler once the book would be completed. So please await the announcements and see you next year in Warsaw.
Thank you.